8 o'clock. Just wait for... Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome also to those who are following tonight's talk at home. This evening, we're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Ian Dungavell to give us this evening's talk. Ian is an architectural historian and conservationist, and before becoming Chief Executive of the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust in 2012, he was director of the Victorian Society, the charity campaigning for Victorian and Edwardian architecture. He has a PhD in architectural history from the University of London and an MSc in the conservation of the historic environment from the College of Estate Management. He is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and I know that he is very well known to many of you in the audience. So welcome, Ian. Tonight, Ian's going to take as his theme Highgate Cemetery, but he's going to look at it from the perspective of an architect who'd been commissioned to design the architecture and grounds. What would his clients have wanted? What was his budget? And how was the enterprise going to make money, given that cemeteries were relatively new things back in the 1830s? And so, without further ado, over to you, Ian.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here at the HLSI. I was shocked to discover that I last spoke about Highgate Cemetery here back in 2014, which is, and many of you were here then. so thank you for coming back. I'm glad we're all still here, but it's a long time ago. And Highgate Cemetery had then just turned 175. And so that was the occasion of that talk. And it's great to be back here because we have another milestone to celebrate this year, which is that the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust, the charity which now runs Highgate Cemetery, has just turned 50 late last year. And it was the first cemetery friends group and founded really with the support of and at the instigation of the Highgate Society. So very much a local creation for a local treasure. Amongst other firsts, I guess the Highgate Cemetery is the first to charge tourists for entry. That's a modern idea. I've got the theme for tonight is modernity. So just to say we're still being modern in the 21st century, or the 20th century as it was when we started charging. It was an idea which had long been accepted for cathedrals, but was a relatively new idea for cemeteries. And so far I get very excited when I find another cemetery which charges tourists to enter. So if you're ever in Malaga, I can recommend going to the British Cemetery in Malaga, which is really lovely, but also it will cost you €5 to get in. We're also the first of the major London cemeteries of our period to get an act of Parliament to enable it to continue in a sustainable way. That was 2022, which means that hopefully our future is not crumbling into dust, as many other cemeteries are doing. And we are also hoping to be the cemetery which has the largest grant from the Heritage Fund for a conservation project. So I'm going to touch wood as I say that because I don't want to queer our chances, but we will be finding out after the local elections next May if the Heritage Fund is going to give us £6.7 million towards the conservation of Highgate Cemetery. And don't get too excited because a huge part of that is going on fixing the drainage. So you won't find a massive transformation when you come and visit, but we'll be setting it up to be sustainable and viable for the future. So anyway, so keep your fingers crossed because it could be us next May. Anyway, tonight I want to start with this image on the screen, which is sepia, and so it suggests a sort of timeless past. It suggests calm. We've got familiar monuments in front of a church, and it really looks more like a church graveyard rather than a new cemetery, although perhaps a bit larger than a normal graveyard. And there's no sign of people in that image. In fact, the only thing that you see that suggests any activity is a new grave has been dug just down here and it's waiting to receive its occupant. And then you think, actually, the monuments all look rather new and shiny. These are all white marble, and if you go to Highgate today, it looks nothing like that. But tonight, rather than dwell on curious stories of people who are buried at Highgate Cemetery, what I want to do is to present the founding of Highgate Cemetery from a business perspective, to show what made it modern. Things like its capital structure, its competitive positioning, its pricing strategy, the new experiences it offered, its marketing strategy, and its use of new materials. So rather than think of cemeteries as old-fashioned and crumbling in the way into the dust, let's think about the cemetery as a modern business venture. And then we'll see the early Victorians as they actually were, entrepreneurial, commercial, and thoroughly modern. So let's say we go back to the 1830s, and this slide, I think, gives a really good idea of the context in which cemeteries were being set up. There's residual anxiety about body snatching. You'll see in the picture on the left-hand side, some ne'er-do-wells under cover of night removing the body of a fresh burial from the coffin that they will then proceed and sell to anatomy schools for dissection. And there was a thriving trade in that made people very anxious. There was also recent cholera outbreaks which made people worried about the disease that decomposing bodies might be spreading. So as recently as 1831, 32, I think around 6,000 people had been killed in London from that epidemic of cholera, and graveyards were partly blamed for the disease. There was also the picture on the right, the horrors of the London burial grounds being an account of the horrible disclosures made by gravediggers with the manner of cutting up dead bodies and other horrible transactions. Just in case you hadn't got the idea, it was a rather horrible thing to be buried in a cemetery at that time, partly because they were overcrowded. They were struggling to keep track with the growth in the population. By 1840, the population of London was around 2 million. It had doubled since 1800. Annual deaths, depending on how you drew a line around London, could have been 25 to 40,000 people, depending on the boundaries. And the current churchyard capacity was catastrophically inadequate. So people were literally cut up and moved around to provide new spaces for burials in churchyard. So there was no permanence to burial, there was no dignity, and there was no security. So there was a better way. And the inspiration for new cemeteries in London came from Paris, from Père Lachaise, which opened in 1804. And it dealt with exactly the same problems as we are having in London, the overcrowded urban churchyards and the desire to remove the dead from the midst of the living. It's now perhaps the most visited cemetery in Europe. I think it gets around 4 million visitors a year. But it struggled initially. It was a Napoleonic project, and in good Napoleonic style, it was called just the East Cemetery, the Cimetière de l'Est, which sounded rather secular and rather unappealing to good Catholics. So the marketing breakthrough came about 15 years later, when they decided it needed some celebrities. So they transferred the remains of Molière and La Fontaine and buried them, or reburied them, in Père Lachaise, as it came to be known. And then the lovers Abelard and Eloise were added. And soon it became a tourist attraction in its own right as people came to visit the grave of these well-known people from the past. By 1830, it had over 33,000 graves and was a must-see visitor attraction for anyone visiting Paris, featured in the guidebooks of the time. And many British people did visit, even though they loved the layout. It actually had been developed on top of an English-style garden, so perhaps we had a natural affinity to that. But they were always rather critical of the French mode of mourning. They thought French people were likely to be effeminate, ostentatious, and rather untrustworthy. So if we do like French things, at the same time we have to despise the French who are actually responsible for it. But many more people saw Père Lachaise than actually made a visit to Paris. A French entrepreneur called Eugène Chauffin built a model of the whole cemetery, 12 foot by 9 feet, containing it's claimed, 26,000 miniature monuments of the memorials in perfect detail. It's a hard thing to do in 12 feet by 9 feet, but apparently it was amazing. For a shilling, you could spend hours studying the model through magnifying glasses. And for an extra sixpence, you got a 16-page booklet explaining the model and describing the 3 types of graves which are available at Père Lachaise with the prices. So it tells you there in that little extract from the catalogue about the communal graves where you're placed in coffins close to each other without any intervening space. And then details about temporary private graves and how much they cost, and perpetual private graves, how much they cost, and how you can convert the temporary to the perpetual ones. Also interesting was how the advertisements in the press promoted the experience of the visit to the virtual Père Lachaise. They promised viewing the model would transport you to Paris faster than the wonderful velocity of steam coaches, even when propelled on a railway. And that ad in the one I've got on the screen there says, you become suddenly transported to the celebrated burial ground of Père Lachaise as to fairly annihilate both time and space. This is time travel, 1830s style. So it's obvious that people found this very modern. And so looking at cemeteries, we're clearly part of the modern world of steam age infrastructure. And so that's all very well, but how many people got to see it? Well, I traced the travel of this model from London, where it started in 1826 and ended back here in 1855. And in between went all over England, well, not all over, but many places, England, Scotland, and Ireland. You can see them marked on the plan there. So it was on a regular tour for 11 years. It spent 14 months in Dublin. Bristol had it for 3 months, and all the fashionable people went to see it. In Liverpool, the model attracted a great proportion of the population, and most of these destinations got it for months. Smaller towns would have the model for weeks. So it's something that people had the time to go and see and could afford to go and see it. So if you think about it for a moment, you have this traveling advertisement for a cemetery business plan, telling about grave prices and how things worked, that's touring the country as entertainment. That's a really marketing masterstroke. And Père Lachaise was very influential with other cemeteries which were set up at the time. So in 1833, Glasgow opened the necropolis on the hill east of Glasgow Cathedral. And incidentally, the model had been there just 3 years earlier in 1830, so model preceded the formation of the necropolis. There was a chap there called John Strang who had been very influenced by an earlier visit to Père Lachaise, and he wrote a booklet arguing for a cemetery to be set up on the model of Père Lachaise in 1831, commenting on the beauty of its gardens, the variety of its walks, and the romantic nature of its situation, with commanding views of Paris and its surrounding areas, which sounds a bit like Highgate Cemetery, doesn't it? The hillside location and the commanding views. So back in London, Kensal Green Cemetery also opened in the same year, 1833. It was run by a commercial cemetery company which had been set up by an Act of Parliament in 1832, the year of the cholera epidemics in London. So that actually got a relatively easy passage through Parliament. It was called the General Cemetery Company, general meaning for all faiths. So it wasn't exclusively for Anglicans as they were the main beneficiaries of churchyard burial. It was also huge. It opened with 54 acres of land, and what was then fashionable Greek revival style architecture. You can see down the bottom on the left the Dissenters' Chapel, the main entrance in the centre, and on the right hand side the Anglican Chapel, all in this fashionable Greek revival style. The first burial was early in early in 1833. She got buried for free. That's a good opening gambit, isn't it? First burial free. And And so this was modern. If you look at the plan there, those sinuous paths, the circle, actually is a lot in common with the layout of Regent's Park, for example. So it's designed on the same principles. What they didn't know when they opened it in 1833 is that the Great Western Railway would come chundering by in a few years in the late 1830s, just after the cemetery had opened, to the great annoyance of the visitors as these massively noisy steam engines came past. And the cemetery company understood themselves as steam age ventures. They just didn't anticipate that there would be actual steam trains so close to their customers. So there's been a bit of a tension in the 19th century between cemeteries and railways. Bishop Blomfield, who was the Bishop of London, he consecrated Highgate later on, was hostile to the London Necropolis railway scheme in the 1850s, arguing that the noise and speed of railways was incompatible with the solemnity of the Christian burial service. And so it's not a competition, but it's great that at Highgate we don't have steam trains rustling by, disturbing the burials. So by the next year, by 1834, there's at least 10 provincial cemeteries operating around the country. And this is one thing we often forget, is that London is not the first. It starts elsewhere. It starts in Manchester, and it starts in Liverpool, chiefly as a way of providing for non-Anglicans. This is the Liverpool Necropolis at Low Hill, begun in 1825, aimed at dissenters. So these were people, you could be buried in your local Anglican churchyard, but you couldn't have your own form of burial service. You had to have the Anglican service if you got one at all. There's stories of nonconformist ministers sort of reading the burial service from the pavement outside the parish churchyard so that the attendees could have the service that they wanted. So this was an astonishingly successful enterprise. Opened in 1825, by 1833, 8,000 people had been buried here. And you can see it's not that big. So coming up to the middle of the 1830s, if not in Kensal Green, and you were living in St Pancras, in the local borough, where would you be buried? Well, we know that there's an increasing population. We know there's inadequate provision. Kensal Green, interestingly, had been prohibited from opening their cemetery in the parish of St Pancras. I'm not quite sure why that was, but it left St Pancras certainly underserved for burial space. And where you would have been buried probably, or perhaps, is in what's now St Pancras Gardens, in the area around St Pancras Old Church. So you see on the plan here, there's the building, there's the church before it was done over by the Victorians, and this is the churchyard. Next to it was some extra accommodation for the parishes of St George's Bloomsbury and the St Giles Burial Ground. And then, of course, if you were unfortunate enough to have died in the St Pancras Workhouse, you might have been buried on site there, which had its own burial ground. So that might have been a rather grim affair. A pauper burial was funded by the parish, what we might call a public health burial today, not a profitable market, and a whole other story. So if you thought that St Pancras Old Church was a bit too far away, it was a bit too remote, it was known to be the haunt of bad types and robbers, then Camden Town would have been much better for you. The Camden Town Cemetery opened in 1805. It started as a detached parochial burial ground for the parish of St Martin in the Fields and was set up by an Act of Parliament in 1804. And they needed an Act of Parliament to be able to bury people from the parish of St Martin in the Fields in St Pancras. And so the Act of Parliament declared that this little corner of Camden Town, and just to orient you, here's Bayham Street, there's the almshouses you may have been past on the bus, there's the Britannia Junction, there's the Camden Town Tube there. So this little corner of Camden Town is now, or was by virtue of that Act of Parliament, not part of St Pancras anymore, but miraculously part of St Martin in the Fields. And so, in theory, only open to the parishioners from St Martin in the Fields. But you could be buried if you were from St Pancras. You just had to pay an out-of-parish burial fee, which made it more expensive. But by 1843, it was taking over 800 burials a year, when the new cemetery at Highgate was only doing around 500. And it would take Highgate up until the end of that decade to approach that. So by 1849, there are about 950 burials a year in Highgate Cemetery. So this little corner of Camden Town is doing remarkably well to be disposing of so many people. For nonconformists, the most well-known burial place was Whitefield's Tabernacle Ground on Tottenham Court Road. Now you might be familiar with Whitefield Gardens. It had been open since 1756, but closed in 1823 to 31, and so it had just recently reopened and started accepting people for burials again. And one interesting connection with Highgate is that the architect of Highgate Cemetery, Stephen Geary, buried his own family there before Highgate Cemetery was opened. So there's a bit of a gap in the market here. A parish would need an Act of Parliament to set up a burial ground outside their limits. That's costly, that's time-consuming. There's limited space in the existing burial grounds. These other ones are not ideal. There's still no principal metropolitan cemetery. The most prestigious places are St Paul's and Westminster Abbey, and Kensal Green will claim that it's prestigious, but at this stage, it doesn't have any royal burials. That comes later in the 1840s with the burial of the Duke of Sussex. So Kensal Green has the west of London covered, or did it? There were soon other competitors proposed. This is an idea for the Grand National Cemetery on Primrose Hill, or near Primrose Hill. And 1830, the plan was lavish in scale, 150 acres of burial ground, and the walls, the garden with that Greek temple in the center is just the center of this with the most expensive burials. Outside that perimeter wall, in these areas, the poorer people would be buried. So this was going to be 150 acres. And the architect was a chap called Francis Goodwin, who later on will be involved at Highgate Cemetery. Needless to say, he was unable to convince investors that this was going to provide a good return on investment. So other people came up with other similar ideas, although on a more manageable scale. George Carden, the barrister who'd set up Kensal Green Cemetery, had a massive falling out with that company and decided to set up a competing company to undermine his own creation. And he announced then in 1834 the Great Western Cemetery, 52 acres, on the Norland estate at Notting Hill on the Bayswater Road, just that little bit nearer to fashionable West London, just to get you before you go to Kensal Green. Just a vicious thing to detract trade from the company he had a falling out with before. To give you an idea of how he thought this would pay, he thought you needed to sell 1,500 family vaults at £21 each. That gave you 31,500 in income, which covered exactly the capital you would need to set up this cemetery. And then everything else, ordinary burials, vault sales, monuments, was pure profit. And his projection that he could bring in £50,000 to £65,000 over 10 years. So it was a very, very profit-driven system. And he put up large signs on the Bayswater Road advertising the Great Western Cemetery Company. The land had been enclosed. And another example of the link that the public made between cemeteries and the steam age, the sign was vandalized, and underneath somebody wrote, NB, new graves warmed by steam. And so, of course, that was never the case. But it shows you that people saw this as somehow in the same ballpark as the newfangled railways. So there were other people with grandiose ideas about cemeteries. This is the total opposite to the Highgate model, the Père Lachaise model of the beautiful garden cemetery on a hill. This is the completely bonkers Thomas Wilson's cemetery pyramid, which comes back in various guises from the 1820s onwards to the 1850s. So what he hated was that the sort of Père Lachaise model would just mean that decomposing bodies would eventually be in the realm of the living because the city would ultimately encroach on them. It took up a lot of land that could be used for other things. And so a much better way, wouldn't it be, to just take 18 acres of land and build a pyramid on top. And so you would fill it up as you went, and each time you filled up one layer, you'd go up to the next and the next and the next. And this is obviously without lifts, although there must be perhaps an ascending chamber or something right in the center you can see going up there. But he expected that the height of a pyramid with an 18-acre base would be 950 feet. And I think the Shard is only about 1,000 feet, isn't it? So how this was going to work, I don't know. But needless to say, the investors didn't really rally round with their cash. But it was a time when there was a lot of money around for infrastructure projects. And just as a reminder of the railways, this is the Euston Arch at the entrance to the London-Birmingham Railway, designed by the architect Philip Hardwick and finished probably about 1838. It's exactly the same time as Highgate Cemetery is being finished. And in fact, Philip Hardwick, railway architect, is also involved with Highgate Cemetery in rather mundane stuff, having negotiations with the neighbours to make sure we could get the consents necessary to open. But there's a real interlinking of people involved with railway projects and cemetery projects. And just further context, think about the great metropolitan improvements, the Regent Street, Regent's Park, developments of ports, as well as the railways. There's so much going on that money is available for all sorts of projects, and many of them fail. So actually won't be able to read this. Let me tell you what this is, though. 1836, this is the Circular to Bankers, and it's telling you about joint stock schemes. So joint stock companies raise money for investment by selling shares to investors who then own a portion of the business and take a share of its profits or losses, as the case may be. So this is the days before the Companies Act. So if you want to set up a company with perpetual succession, you need an Act of Parliament, and that's expensive and difficult, or you need to get a royal charter, and that's even more expensive and more difficult. So it's not until, I think, the 1840s that the start of companies being formed by registration happens. So it is a palaver to get this done. But look at that list. And I'll just, you can't see it, but this is the list of Liverpool new joint stock company formations in 1836. And this is the ones in Manchester. And you can see there's a great number of them happening. And some of those are involved with cemeteries. And again, you can't read this, but let me tell you about them. So this is 1836. Just 5 ads from the Manchester Guardian. 2nd of April, 9th of April, 23rd of April, 30th of April, 30th of April. So a relatively short period of time, 1 month. 5 joint stock cemetery companies to be formed in Manchester. Ardwick Cemetery. And Ardwick Cemetery wanted £20,000 from investors, and it was going to attract them because another cemetery which had been set up was paying large dividends to the proprietors, and the value of shares had gone through the roof. They cost £10 to buy, and they were now trading at £37. Manchester General Cemetery, the next one there, also inspired by public health concerns. It doesn't go on so much about the return on your investment. But the next one, the Necropolis, they wanted £30,000. They're inspired by the fact that the launch of Ardwick had resulted in demand almost 10 times the number of shares available. So there's clearly great encouragement. Salford and Hume, again, also commercial interest. This Salford, Pendleton, Hume and Broughton Royal Cemetery, I'm not sure any royals knew about this, but anyway, Royal adds some attraction to investors. They wanted £40,000 in capital. And again, that was all about the return on investment. And sometimes, actually, these were just dodgy, and they would attract investors, and the company would just disappear with the deposits that people had paid on that investment. So people were a bit perplexed by this joint stock mania. And this is the Manchester Guardian again in April, really scratching its head about the enthusiasm that people have for this sort of investment. It says, we've looked at the advertising pages in some of the newspapers, our own amongst the number, and have seen the multitude of schemes so invitingly brought forward. We've not been able to refrain from asking ourselves the question, are people mad? And it has been a little less difficult to suppress the answer, which we believe to be virtually the true one. They are. So cemeteries, the same as this. And it happens in London. There's famously 8 cemeteries, which were set up in the 1830s and 40s. People have forgotten about one of them, so you'll hear about the Magnificent Seven. But there were lots of other schemes for setting up cemeteries in London that never actually eventuated. So we have, just to orient you, we have over here Kensal Green in the west of London, Highgate Cemetery here in the north, Cardens Bayswater Cemetery was going to be here, just that little bit close to the fashionable West End. And the next kid on the block was the South Metropolitan Cemetery Company at West Norwood. Unfortunately, it's just a little bit off my map, but you know where West Norwood is. And the other ones really, again, the success of Kensal Green really inspired a lot of wannabes to set up other cemeteries. And on the model of Paris, which had set up cemeteries north, east, Père Lachaise, south, Montmartre, Montparnasse, it made sense to have the cardinal points covered. So you can see the commercial cemetery development in London also does that, but with 8 cemeteries around the capital. So South Metropolitan Cemetery Company gets its Act of Parliament in 1836, same year as Highgate Cemetery. It wants you to buy its shares priced at £25. It's got 3,000 of them, so it's looking for £75,000 in capital. That's a big difference from those Liverpool and Manchester cemeteries. It's going to have 40 acres, and it's going to have Gothic architecture now. So that Greek style, only a few years later, is starting to look a bit old-fashioned, starting to look a bit early 19th century. And this was the decade. The 1830s is a real decade of change towards the Gothic style. The architect was William Type. He designed railways as well. He was a respectable businessman. Altogether, actually, you'd probably be much better putting your money into the South Metropolitan Cemetery Company than many other places. So that's a competitor way at the bottom of London. So you would think out of the way of Highgate. There's just an image or a couple of images of the splendid chapels, unfortunately all demolished, and that landscape on the top left there, looking a bit like that Highgate photograph we started with, where the glaring white marble is really in your face, and the serpentine layout of the paths, really something that we've seen in general park layouts of the time. And so we come back to Highgate, and this is the site of what you might call Highgate Cemetery Mark I, the Highgate Cemetery that nobody's ever heard of, where there's the announcement in 1832 that a cemetery is going to be built on this site. And the newspaper said the site appears to be well chosen. The area in front of St. Michael's Church, which you can see was actually a brand new building at the time. And the newness of St. Michael's Church, I think, is one of the things that makes the site really attractive, because there's a real landmark on the horizon. And the Church of Highgate was a marker that people were really aware of. So it gave a new cemetery a prominence that it may not have otherwise had. So the architect was Francis Goodwin, again, the guy who was going to do that 150-acre of Greek, sort of Acropolis-style cemetery down in Primrose Hill. This time, the plans were a lot more modest. But unfortunately, he gets distracted by entering the competition for rebuilding the Houses of Parliament after the big fire. And he's working so hard, he ends up, unfortunately, dying of a stroke in 1835. So that puts an end to Highgate Cemetery Mark I. And then along comes another group of people, still wanting the same site in Highgate, what you might call Highgate Cemetery Mark II, which is now to be set up by something called the London Cemetery Company. And what they want is £80,000, but they're going to divide it into 4,000 shares of £20 each. So the price of entry, if you're an investor, is 20% lower. £25, the other place is £20 at the London Cemetery Company. And there's a list of the provisional committee and what have you. And the real self-styled leader or founder of the London Cemetery Company is the architect Stephen Geary, who's a really interesting character, and one of our volunteers and former trustees of the cemetery, Stuart Orr, has almost finished a book. He's looking for a publisher, so I'm making a shameless plea for anyone who's interested in really interesting architectural publishing to get in touch. We need to find a book publisher for his book on Stephen Geary. With Stephen Geary, just before we go on to him, the small print at the bottom here talks about the realization of large profits to the proprietors of cemeteries already established. So again, this is all about money. And Stephen Geary is one of these amazing early Victorian figures who can do anything. So he's an architect. He's perhaps best known for a building which is no longer there. This is the monument called the King's Cross, which gave its name to the area of King's Cross. It was actually built, although it didn't look quite like this in execution, mainly due to a lack of funds. But it was a monument here in honour of George the Fourth, put up in 1830. So Geary also was famous for designing early gin palaces in London. He could do designs for street paving, for fire escapes. He could sell you a second-hand steam engine if you wanted to do that. He's very interested in cemetery companies. He had entered the competition to design Kensal Green back in 1831, didn't succeed. And so it seems like his lesson from that was if you wanted to design a cemetery, then set up the company yourself. That way you don't have to compete with other architects for the job. So the prospectus, this is the back page of the prospectus, which highlights that there's no major cemetery serving North London. The south is inadequately provided for. And here it says, in consequence of a requisition numerously and respectably signed from the Eastern District, they want to put up a cemetery in East London as well. So poor old Kensal Green has just got one cemetery in the west, and the poor old South Metropolitan Cemetery Company has got one cemetery in the south, 40 acres or so, 54 at Kensal Green. And you have the London Cemetery Company muscling in and creating a monopoly of these cardinal points. So it's going to do north, it's going to do south and compete with the West Norwood people, and it's also going to do east. And in the fifth paragraph down here, again, you probably can't read it, but it says it's confidently expected that this company must ensure very large returns for the capital invested. The shares of the General Cemetery Company Kensal Green are now in great demand at £20 premium. So there's clearly loads of money to be made with that. This is the early plan for the cemetery. We know it's before the Act of Parliament because there's no Anglican chapel here. So the clear intention was that St Michael's Church would be the Anglican chapel for the cemetery, and this structure down here is the Dissenters' Chapel. That obviously didn't happen. This is a preliminary scheme before they took to the church authorities, because when it came time to get the Act of Parliament, one of the restrictions was that any chapel with bells needed to be at least 300 yards away from St Michael's Church. So they wanted to keep the commercial cemetery company very much at arm's length, which explains why the current chapels are right down here at the bottom of the site. It's about 300 yards from there to there. So thankfully, they're just able to get those chapels in. And finally, the Act of Parliament comes in on the 17th of August, 1836. And of course, the words they choose here are not about money, they're about the fact that burial provision is insufficient. And these wonderful people have come forward willing at their own costs and charges to set up these cemeteries. So as you'd expect, the tone is quite different. So I've mentioned the three cemetery companies should have been set up by this stage. And you can see the advantages of each of them and the increasing amount of money they want. 45,000 for the General Cemetery Company back in 1832, 75,000 for the South Metropolitan Company, and 100,000 by the time the London Cemetery Company gets going to build its 3 cemeteries, north, south, and east. But if you look at the bottom line, how long it took from start to opening, that is the consecration of the cemetery. 197 days at Kensal Green, that's because it opened before they'd built all the chapels and things. That's really speedy. 497 days, so 2.5 times as much to get the South Metropolitan Cemetery open, again because they were open before the chapels and things were built. And then Highgate Cemetery, from start to consecration, took 1006. So that's double West Norwood and 5 times longer than the General Cemetery Company. And there's all sorts of reasons for that which are too complicated to go into. So they may have done well with their clever Act of Parliament. They may have done well getting the monopoly, but they certainly had some problems getting open. The one thing they did succeed on for their commercial advantage was all of these private cemeteries, when they were consecrated, the Act of Parliament extracted from them a royalty for the incumbents of the parishes from whence the deceased came. So if you were buried in West Norwood Cemetery, you came from a neighbouring parish, the company had to pay in compensation to the vicar 7 shillings and 6pence if you were buried in open ground, or at Highgate, that figure was much, much less, 1 shilling and 6pence. So the fees paid to the incumbents were massively lower at Highgate Cemetery than they were at the other cemeteries. And do you know what? This really annoyed everyone. It really annoyed everyone that the London Cemetery Company got the monopoly and could do 3 cemeteries, and it really annoyed them that they didn't have to pay so much in compensation. But this is how Highgate Cemetery looked when it opened. I just wanted to quickly point out to you some of the locations. So St. Michael's Church up here, the terrace catacombs, the Circle of Lebanon with the Lebanon cedar there, and then moving down to the chapels here. This was the cemetery superintendent's house, now the lodge in Waterloo Park, and that did that duty until the 1870s when they built a new cemetery superintendent's house there. I'm not bitter, that's where I should be living, but I've got over that. I'll live it down in Gospel Oak instead. Anyway, that's the cemetery as opened. And of course they had to advertise it. Marketing was a very important thing. So the big, this is the Morning Post, 2 advertisements. The big white one I'm really interested in because it doesn't actually tell you much about how much it cost to buy a grave, but it does tell you that the Egyptian catacombs presenting the largest specimen of that rare style of architecture in this country, and the view from the Gothic terrace for 30 miles are objects of peculiar interest and beauty so very near London. So it's not about buying graves, it's about the experience of visiting the cemetery. But there's some other sort of informational things here that we're familiar with from modern visitor information. How to get there. The smaller ad tells you to avoid Highgate Hill, go by Kentish Town. Those omnibuses from Tottenham Court Road go close to the cemetery every 10 minutes, fares 6pence. So that's astonishing. Omnibuses, modern mode of travel that had been introduced less than 10 years earlier than Highgate Cemetery, early in the 1860s, but 6pence, that's a fair whack. If you're a working Londoner, you're not going to be catching the omnibus from Tottenham Court Road to Kentish Town. You're going to be walking. And so what this does is this is positioning Highgate Cemetery as something for the middle classes. The bigger ad starts off with the nobility and gentry are respectfully invited to inspect the cemetery. So there's snob appeal, there's class, there's social proof there. It says many interments have already taken place. So they're creating that desire. These are all modern marketing techniques. We're removing friction from the process by giving you travel directions. We're even telling you what the frequency of the omnibus is every 10 minutes. And they're also telling you that there's safety and security here. Armed patrols are in the cemetery every night. for secure catacombs. So don't be worried about the body snatchers. You'll be safe here. But back to the spectacle. This is the Egyptian spectacle. You've got the entry to the Egyptian Avenue. And look at these people. They don't look like they're mourners. They're having a nice time, a nice wander in this wonderful planted landscape. So just look at some of the architectural features from the top of the site down. The top left, we've got St. Michael's Church. Sitting, it looks like, on the terrace catacombs. And in front of them is the circle of Lebanon with just, you can see half of that cedar tree which used to be there. Underneath you can see the whole terrace catacombs and the Lebanon circle. Looking now out towards London, that wonderful view we heard described of Père Lachaise, the same view you would have got from the necropolis in Glasgow from that hillside. Of course, you wouldn't have had St. Paul's Cathedral there on the horizon, just to orient you, to show you where the city was. And then looking back at the top right, the Egyptian Avenue, with again St. Michael's appearing there. It's really an important landmark in the cemetery to give you this impression that what you're not looking at is a commercial cemetery. It's more like a nice, comfortable, big churchyard with St. Michael's there providing a very comforting silhouette in the background. And then right at the front there, you've got the chapels down at the bottom of the side. But just a few things to finish up with about the architecture. I said it's Gothic now. That's moving towards a more fashionable style. Of course, the Egyptian style is a source of great interest in the early 19th century as well. But on top of the terrace catacombs, there was this. It's a badge of Cecil's Asphalt, or Claridge's patent Cecil Asphalt Company, with the year of its foundation, 1838. And so don't worry, I'm not going to give you a lecture on the history of asphalt, although it's really fascinating. And it was the wonder material of the 1830s. There's lots of companies, lots of joint stock companies who are being set up also to exploit asphalt, which is becoming widely used, particularly for paving, but also for waterproofing railway arches, and in fact for waterproofing the roof of our terrace catacombs. And the firm only set up in 1838, so it's installed at Highgate in the first year of that company. And who's involved? The engineer Mark Brunel is a trustee of the company, and his son Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the great railway engineer, was the consulting engineer to this company. So Brunel has got to be involved with the terrace catacombs at Highgate Cemetery. I just can't prove it, which is quite frustrating, because the other thing that seals the deal in my book is that Isambard Kingdom Brunel's sister, Sophia, was married to the deputy chair of the London Cemetery Company, which is building the catacombs. So there's that family connection as well. So we just need to find the documentation. So any Brunel experts out there, please help. Chapels, architecture, I mentioned these at the bottom of the site. And I just wanted to make the point. People have been rude about our chapels in the past. Silly architectural historians who think that everything should be archaeological and have missed the sort of fun that you can have with Gothic. So here we have, on the top, an array of pinnacles and the cupolas showing this as the verve and energy that Geary has, that he shares with architects like Francis Goodwin, like John Nash, like James Wyatt, rather than the dryness of some of the more antiquarian-minded Gothic architects of the later 19th century. And one of the contemporary critics wrote, "As an eye trap, it is excellent, being impossible to pass it by without wonder," which I really agree with, except I'm not sure that was meant as a compliment. But I think that's precisely what makes our chapel outstanding in the world of English 19th century chapels. And again, it's difficult for us to see it with the light of the contemporaries, but it also would have had a feeling of modernity about it. And the building underneath it, some of you may recognize, it's the new Tudor Gothic gatehouse, which encloses the front court at King's College in Cambridge. And it had only been finished 10 years earlier. And I think if you squint, you can see that the verticality of those pinnacles, the cupola, well, ours is a little bit smaller than the King's College one. This is built in stone, ours is built in bricks. But we have the same sort of feeling of a college gateway with the entrance through the centre here into the cemetery, except on either side we've got an Anglican chapel and a dissenters' chapel. But there's clearly an awareness of modern styles of architecture. And Pevsner, when he's describing the King's College building, says it's designed with gusto, not mean like so much neo-Gothic work, and the detail is by no means dull. And when finally, as part of our lottery project, well, no, it's not part of our lottery project, when finally in 20 years' time, we're on stage 5 of our conservation project, we'll put these pinnacles back, and there will be car crashes in Swains Lane as people stop to admire our wonderful building. So I just wanted to finish with some thoughts about the commercial arrangements of these new joint stock cemetery companies. And one of the things that was a bit interesting is you never really saw, I think, the price list of your local parish church. If you wanted to be buried there, you probably went along and saw the sexton or the church wards, and they told you what the fee was. But these new cemetery companies published in the newspapers their scale of charges. And it's really quite interesting, the effect that had on people. So people, I think some of them were taken short by it. There's an odd association of, someone said, commercial and sepulchral ideas, where these are laid out almost like a restaurant menu of what you can have. There was, I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, there was also a more extensive price list with the list of the upgrades that were possible. And there's some articles in the press where they really just poke fun at this. And there was one of them is called Grave Literature, and they go through these price lists as if they're a restaurant menu. And so they're saying things like, what will Sir have for eternity? The Eastern Public Vault at 6 guineas or the Central Public Vault at 10? You know, and in all of these things, there's an upgrade. So interesting here, the fees for common. You start at the entry level, the low grade fees, common grave, no charge to the ground, £1, 5 shillings for an adult. And then there's the upgrades. If you want a family grave, well, then you pay for the ground, you pay for the interment. And then, if you're really posh, you get ground for a family vault, which is going to cost you 15 guineas and 5 guineas for an interment. So there's a low base price to attract the customers. And there's extra add-on charges. So if you want to be buried at a particular time of day, before 3 p.m. or after sunset, you pay an extra 7 shillings. On a windy day, if you wanted a weather screen so you're a bit more comfortable while the interment is taking place, there was an extra charge for that. If you wanted the company to look after your grave for you, make sure it's tidy, there was a charge either per year or a perpetuity charge that you could pay. Or if you wanted it planted with flowers, then again, there was an extra uplift. And then there were also premium experiences. So if you wanted the private gallery, the VIP mourning room, if you like, as part of our chapel, that would cost you an extra guinea at your funeral. And if you wanted the chapel draped in black cloth, there was an extra charge for that. So this is drip pricing. This is identical to modern budget airlines. It's like Ryanair. You want the seat. Oh, you want to take a bag, did you? Oh, you want a priority. You want to sit next to someone. There's an extra charge for everything. And so, we were doing it back, well, unfortunately, you might say, back in the 19th century, and Ryanair is still doing that same model today. The other thing I've highlighted here is at the bottom, you just might be able to make out here, parties presenting tickets. So the cemetery is closed on Sundays, except to funerals and to parties presenting tickets from the office. And this is one of the tokens. This is in the collection of the British Museum. But Michael Hammerson very kindly had one of these and also has given it to the cemetery for our collection. And so you needed to present these on Sundays if you wanted to visit, but you could only get them from the office in Moorgate Street during the week. And this is a great way of excluding the troublesome working classes who might otherwise have come and destroyed the tranquility of the cemetery on Sundays. And the reassuring thing, in terms of modernity, the reassuring thing is that people in the 1830s were every bit as badly behaved as we are today. And so there's no golden age when people didn't vandalize cemetery monuments, carve their names into things, steal flowers, do inappropriate things of all sorts of descriptions behind gravestones. That was all going on. And so at Kensal Green and at Highgate both employed policemen to monitor the behavior of visitors, particularly on Sundays, because they were attracted to these wonderful, planted, beautiful landscapes. And so you then, I guess this could also be another marketing thing, isn't it? You turn the problem of being overrun with rough types, perhaps on Sundays, into a feature. You're marketing then scarcity and exclusivity as something which is desirable. So Kensal Green set up, West Norwood set up, Highgate set up, and the other ones follow, really quite shortly afterwards. But of course, once Highgate has got its Act of Parliament, it doesn't want anyone else to be formed at all because they're competition. It never got around to building. The London Cemetery Company never got around to building a cemetery in the east. That was taken by other companies which got there sooner, Tower Hamlets and Victoria Park Cemetery. It did form a southern cemetery, Nunhead, you could just see at the base of the map there. And this caused lots of friction between the London Cemetery Company and the South Metropolitan Company as our Act of Parliament was going through, which was why it took 5 times as long for Highgate to get open as it did Kensal Green. But I've looked at the cemetery mania, the joint stock mania in 1836. Once we get our Act of Parliament, then the London Cemetery Company, of course, becomes vigorously opposed to the formation of new cemetery companies. There's the idea that London is becoming the city of the dead. While there may be 100 acres of churchyards, the cemetery space, which had already been improved by 1837, was 500 acres. That was enough for centuries, they said. And so then you find the London Cemetery Company taking potshot and encouraging a wave of antagonism towards the cemetery mania, which would make London the city of the dead and encased in cemeteries. The promoters of new cemetery companies have shown a desire to turn the British metropolis into a necropolis, a city of the dead, entombing around it with sepulchres, shutting up every avenue, enclosing every green field, and reducing the lovely scenery of Hampstead and the northern suburbs of London to the appearance of a depository of the dark and cruel genius of desolation. So no more cemetery companies, says the London Cemetery Company. So I think that sort of brings us to the end of the idea of Highgate as a cemetery for the steam age. But looking at the thing I found most amusing was that graffiti artist who wrote "New graves warmed by steam," who clearly saw that was that link. And contemporary criticism in the press talks about newfangled joint stock company burying grounds. And so those people are understanding what a lot of us have forgotten today, is that in the 1830s, cemeteries and the railways belonged to the same world of newness and modernity. They were new ways of doing things. It wasn't just about steam. It was about new capital forms, so joint stock companies, payment of dividends to investors, new corporate structures, boards, crises with governance, new infrastructure being built, now private, for profit, approved by Parliament, not by the church. New marketing, advertising, branding, prioritising experiences, and new business models where you have tiered pricing, subscription models to get as much money out of you as you possibly can. And Highgate Cemetery exemplified all of this, and so it really was a cemetery for the steam age. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you ever so much for a very fascinating talk. That was really excellent. We've got a few minutes for questions. Let's have a couple of questions, then everyone's welcome to come for a glass of wine next door. If I could just ask one quick question. How did the investors get on? I mean, they paid £20 a share. Do we know how the share price went?
Sorry,
how the shares, did they do well, the shares?
No, I'm going to do that, find out how that went, how the price went up. Yeah.
Good, excellent. Okay, any questions? No, sadly.
Yes, when you made your summary at the end, you mentioned all sorts of reasons why this was happening, but you didn't mention, at least I didn't hear you mention, a vast increase of population.
I started at the front with yeah. So there were just many more people dying, many more people in London, and so the mortality was 25 to, depending on the where you drew the line around London, 25, 40,000 people a year dying, and so people did the sums. I think that's where Thomas Wilson got his idea that if 40,000 people died a year, that would pay for that remarkable 950-foot tall pyramid. That would be it. Yeah.
And the other thing is that when you mentioned Père Lachaise, you said that's where it sort of came from there. And you also mentioned about the expenses and things in your introduction, what was going on. What they've done in France is you now, in cemeteries, you have a concession. So when you're buried there for 25 years, 50 years, whatever, and then it's emptied and something else happens. So my question is, does that happen in this country as well?
Sort of, is the answer. That's a normal thing in France. Here we're just getting used to it. Yeah. And so if you were to buy a grave at a local cemetery, it will often come with a time. I was speaking to some people today who'd bought a grave in Putney, I think, for 40 years. Yeah. And I said, what happens at the end of 40 years? And they said, oh, I don't know, I'm not that bothered. And then, but when the London Cemetery Company was set up, the answer was it was empowered to sell graves for a specific period of time or in perpetuity. But there was no way, like the French were doing, about removing the remains and putting them in the ossuary at in the centre of Père Lachaise. So here, the perpetuity model fell down because there was no income. You fill up the grave. There's nothing you can do. You don't remove it anywhere. And there's no annual fee. And so that was partly why the cemeteries went bust. Mm. And so what happened at Highgate in 2022 is the Highgate Cemetery Act came in, and we got powers which are already available to local authority cemeteries in London to reuse graves. So we are enabled to take back graves which were sold in perpetuity, and to either lower the remains in that grave or to move them somewhere else in the cemetery. Subject, you'll be pleased to hear, to lots of safeguards to protect the interest of families and relatives. Yeah. And so we've started doing that, but we've started doing it with empty graves.
Has that started in Highgate?
Yes, yeah. We started doing it with empty graves, and we've also started doing it with graves which are partially occupied, because the Victorians would dig down 20 feet, we only dig down 8 feet. And so people are quite happy with the idea there's someone 12 foot down, and they will be buying new space on top of that. What we haven't done yet is removed monuments to create space for new people to put monuments up. Mm. And that's going to be an interesting thing when we come to that. And I think there'll be some where it's easy to do because the monuments are so degraded that no sensible person would say that you must keep this. But then there'll be all sorts of difficulties as you go along as well. How should we preserve the monument and enable new burials? And Père Lachaise, for example, got worldwide attention late last year when they had a lottery where there were 10 graves at Père Lachaise, 10 at Montmartre, 10 at Montparnasse, and you could go into a lottery to get the right to restore the memorial on the grave and then to inter beneath that. So the graves had been emptied and the remains put in the ossuary. But a condition of that was that you had to efface the names on the existing memorial, and so you're restoring something that has purely memorial value but no commemorative value.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
yes.
We don't know. This is all to come.
Any other questions?
Can I ask,
yes.
How did the people of Highgate in the 1830s view the arrival of a cemetery in their midst?
That's a good question. Some of them, I'm sure, were absolutely thrilled, because it would mean that there was a lovely place to burial on their doorstep. Other people were certainly not happy at all. And for the same reasons that people didn't want cemeteries in the midst of the city, the people who lived downhill from Highgate Cemetery were very worried about what that would do to the water supply. Because we all know tributaries of the River Fleet are all through. And so what effect would the decaying bodies buried in Highgate Cemetery have on that? And so there were hygiene reasons. There are other people who'd just been enjoying having the place rather quiet. And so planning in Highgate in the 1830s was no easier than planning in Highgate in the 2020s, I imagine. So one of the things that really annoyed people was the northern entrance to the cemetery, which was down the side of St. Michael's Church. And so people would come down the side of St. Michael's Church and then go onto the terrace catacombs for a promenade. And this so annoyed the homeowners who otherwise had been overlooking that the entrance was stopped up and another entrance was created further away from the church. So the short answer is lots of people didn't like it that much. But it did provide lots of jobs. And so jobs for gardeners, jobs for stonemasons. And if you look in the census records of some of our volunteers have been doing, there's really interesting things about who's living where and what sort of jobs that they're doing. But that follows the formation of the cemetery by some years.
Thank you. Perhaps one final question. If a grave cost between 1 and 5 guineas in 1841, given the effects of inflation and so on, how much would it cost today?
I'd say it's probably gone up a lot more than inflation. And so it's very difficult to compare historical value of money. But I did look at it a number of years ago, and the yardstick was actually per square metre. I don't think we were much different from Highgate residential property, but there's no council tax and there's no service charges.
Very good to know. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Ian. And we're all now just going to adjourn next door for a glass of wine. Thank you again.
Thank you.